Saving their family farm means harvesting the first honey before greedy developers take it all. The road to Aldergrove curved through fields that had once been green in Nora's childhood memories, but now looked pale and neglected under the gray sky. The rental car rolled slowly over the gravel, as if even the tires felt the weight of returning to a place she had spent years trying to forget. Nora kept both hands on the steering wheel, although the road was empty. The gesture was less about driving and more about control. She preferred control. A wooden sign appeared beside the narrow lane ahead. The paint was chipped but still readable. Aldergrove Farm. The letters were carved by hand decades ago. Her father had once told her he made the sign himself when Nora was 5. That she remembered sitting on the grass, watching him carve each letter slowly with a pocket knife. Back then the farm had smelled of fresh hay and apple blossoms. Now the sign leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. Nora did not stop the car. She drove past the sign and followed the lane toward the farmhouse. The fields on both sides looked uneven. Some were empty, some were overgrown. Fences sagged where posts had rotted, and a tractor stood near a barn like an abandoned relic. The entire property looked as if time had slowed and then simply forgotten to move again. She parked near the front porch and turned off the engine. The silence came immediately and heavily. Without the sound of the car, the place felt larger than she remembered. The farmhouse looked exactly the same and completely different at once. White paint faded. Gray boards exposed in places. A porch swing moved slightly in the wind, though nobody had touched it. Nora stepped out of the car and closed the door carefully. The smell of soil and wood drifted through the air. Not unpleasant. Not comforting either. Just familiar enough to disturb the calm distance she had built during years in Chicago. She walked up the steps. The wood creaked under her weight. The same sound she remembered from childhood when she used to run across the porch chasing the farm dog. That memory appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. She forced herself to focus on the present. She had not come here for memories. She had come to finish something. The door opened before she knocked. Harry stood there, already dressed in a black jacket. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. That he looked older than when she last saw him 2 years ago, but also more controlled, as if every muscle in his face had learned discipline. "You're late," Harry said. "Traffic leaving the city," Nora replied. Harry stepped aside to let her enter. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. The interior looked cleaner than she expected. Harry had always been organized, even as a teenager. Every chair stood exactly where it belonged. The kitchen counter was empty except for a single folder of documents. Nora noticed the folder immediately. "Those the papers?" "Yes." That was quick. Harry closed the door behind her. It wasn't difficult. The bank already prepared half the paperwork months ago. Nora studied him briefly. "You expected this?" Harry shrugged slightly. "I prepared for it." The sentence carried no emotion, but the implication was clear that he had known the farm would collapse eventually. The debts, the falling harvests, the maintenance costs. Everything had been building toward this outcome for years. Nora removed her coat and placed it on a chair. "The funeral starts in 40 minutes. Harry nodded. "The town hall arranged everything. The pastor will speak. And after? After we sign." The clarity of that statement felt almost mechanical. Nora appreciated it. She did not want long discussions. She had taken 3 days off work to come here. That was already more time than she wanted to spend in this town. She walked toward the kitchen window. From there she could see the barn and the long line of trees that gave the farm its name. The alders stood silent in the wind. Their branches barely moved. Harry joined her at the window. "Developers are interested. The land is valuable because of the highway expansion. They're planning residential properties, small eco-neighborhoods." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Eco-neighborhoods on farmland. That's the marketing language. And the price. Enough to close the debts and leave us both with something useful." Nora folded her arms. "Useful means you already accepted their offer." "I negotiated," Harry corrected. "But we still need your signature." Nora nodded slowly. She had expected that. She looked again at the trees. The farm had once seemed enormous when she was a child. Now it looked fragile. The buildings aged, the soil uneven, the future uncertain. Selling made sense, logically, financially, emotionally. Logically, it was the cleanest ending to a long, slow failure. "Fine," she said. "We sign after the funeral." Harry's shoulders relaxed almost invisibly. He had been waiting for that sentence. They drove to the cemetery together. The road passed through the center of the small town. Nora noticed how little had changed: the grocery store, the repair shop, the diner near the gas station, all still standing as if preserved in a photograph from 20 years ago. People walked along the sidewalks. Some of them recognized the car. Some turned their heads slightly. Some simply watched. The cemetery stood on a hill behind the church. Clouds moved slowly above the rows of stones that a small group of people had already gathered near the open grave. Nora recognized several faces, though she could not immediately recall their names. When she stepped out of the car, the quiet conversation stopped briefly. Then they resumed with softer tones. The town remembered her as the girl who left. She could almost hear the unspoken sentence. She went to the city and never came back. The pastor began the ceremony with a calm voice. He spoke about work and dedication. He spoke about land and responsibility. He spoke about Nora's father as a man who believed that the soil returned exactly what a person gave to it. Nora listened without moving. Harry stood beside her with the same controlled posture he used inside the house. The speech ended. The coffin was lowered slowly into the ground. The ropes moved carefully under the hands of two workers. The sound of soil falling on wood followed soon after, a dull, steady rhythm. Nora watched the process with quiet attention. She felt sadness, but it arrived in a distant way, like a memory of emotion rather than the emotion itself. When the ceremony ended, people approached them one by one, offering condolences. The words repeated themselves politely. Nora thanked them with short replies. She had never liked long displays of sympathy. They felt like rehearsed lines from a script. After the last person left the cemetery, Harry checked his watch. The notary expects us at 3. Already arranged? Yes. Nora sighed quietly. You really planned everything. Harry looked toward the distant fields. Someone had to. They returned to the farm briefly before the meeting. Nora wanted to see the barns once more before signing anything. She walked across the yard while Harry remained near the house, speaking on the phone. The wind carried faint sounds from the surrounding fields. The property felt empty, without animals moving through it. The main barn door stood partially open. Nora pushed it wider and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and straw. Light entered through cracks in the wooden walls, forming narrow beams across the floor. Stalls lined both sides of the building. Most of them were empty. She counted automatically. 1, 2, 3, 7, 10. All empty, except the final stall near the back. A horse stood there quietly. The animal lifted its head when Nora approached. Its coat was dark brown with small gray patches near the neck. Older but still strong. Its eyes watched her calmly. Hello, Nora said softly. She reached out and touched the wooden gate of the stall. The horse moved slightly closer, as if recognizing the presence of another living creature after long hours of silence. You shouldn't stand that close. The voice came from behind her. Nora turned sharply. A man stood near the entrance of the barn. He wore a dark jacket and work boots. Dust clung to the lower edges of his jeans. His posture suggested he had been observing the horse before she arrived. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then recognition appeared slowly in Nora's expression. Caleb. The man nodded once. Nora. The name sounded different when he said it. The same voice she remembered from school, but deeper, now more restrained. Nora crossed her arms instinctively. What are you doing here? Caleb stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. Your father asked me to check on the horse weeks ago. He said it might need proper care if something happened to him. Nora looked back at the animal. He expected this. Caleb did not answer immediately. He studied the stall, then the old equipment hanging nearby. Your father expected many things. The sentence carried quiet meaning. Nora felt irritation rise slightly. She had not come here to discuss philosophical expectations with someone she barely liked. I'm selling the farm, she said directly. So the horse will probably be transferred to another stable. Caleb's gaze moved to her again. You already decided. Yes. That was fast. Nora shrugged. It's practical. Caleb looked around the barn slowly. The empty stalls, the worn tools, the beams of light crossing the dusty floor. Practical isn't always the same as right. Nora felt a spark of old irritation. She remembered this tone from school. Caleb had always spoken as if every simple situation carried hidden layers of meaning. Good thing the decision isn't yours, she replied. Caleb's mouth curved slightly in something that was not exactly a smile. No, it isn't. Silence settled between them for a moment. The horse shifted its weight softly against the straw. Nora noticed that Caleb's presence made the barn feel less abandoned, yet strangely more tense at the same time. "You came to buy the horse?" she asked. "To evaluate it." "For what purpose?" "For keeping the bloodline alive if possible." Nora laughed quietly. "Even the horse has more future planning than this farm." Caleb met her eyes again. This time the expression was more serious. "You might want to hear the will before making final decisions." Nora frowned slightly. "The will?" "Yes." "What about it?" Caleb leaned one shoulder against the wooden post beside him. "Your father talked about conditions." Nora stared at him. "Conditions for what?" Caleb pushed away from the post and walked toward the exit of the barn. The light outside framed his figure briefly. "For the future of this place," he said. Then he stepped outside, leaving Nora standing beside the stall with the horse watching her quietly. The barn returned to silence, but the calm certainty she had felt earlier was no longer there. That a small, uncomfortable question had entered the room with Caleb and refused to leave. The barn remained quiet after Caleb left, but the silence felt different now. That it carried a thin tension that had not existed when Nora first stepped inside. She rested her hands on the wooden gate of the stall and watched the horse breathe slowly. The animal seemed calm, completely unaware that its future might depend on decisions made by people who barely understood each other anymore. Nora exhaled slowly. She disliked uncertainty, and Caleb had just introduced exactly that. Harry had told her the documents were simple. The farm would be sold. The debts would disappear. The matter would close. That plan had been clear, organized, predictable. Conditions in the will did not fit that structure. She stepped out of the barn and walked back toward the house. Caleb's truck stood near the fence line, but he was not inside it. He stood beside the vehicle looking across the fields as if measuring the land with his eyes. When Nora approached, he turned slightly, acknowledging her presence without speaking first. "You enjoy dramatic hints?" Nora asked. Caleb shrugged. "I didn't say anything dramatic. You said my father left conditions." "He did." "Then explain." Caleb opened the truck door and leaned one arm against it. "I only know what he mentioned during a conversation 2 months ago. He asked if I still understood bees." Nora blinked. "Bees?" "Yes." "What does that have to do with the farm being bankrupt?" Caleb looked toward the line of alder trees again. "Your father believed the land could recover. He thought the soil was still strong enough if someone rebuilt the ecosystem around it. By keeping bees. That was part of it." Nora shook her head lightly. "You're telling me he wanted to fix decades of financial collapse with honey?" Caleb did not react to the sarcasm. He said the farm started with bees before it started with crops. Nora hesitated. That detail was unfamiliar. She remembered many things about childhood on the farm, but bees had never been part of the daily routine when she was young. "Even if that's true," she said, "it doesn't change the numbers." Caleb nodded once. "Numbers rarely change the past. Fortunately, they control the future." Caleb studied her expression carefully, as if trying to measure how serious her decision truly was. "Maybe you'll know more after the will is read." Nora crossed her arms again. "You seem strangely confident about that." "I'm not confident that I'm curious." The difference between those two words was subtle, but it lingered in the air between them. Nora disliked the feeling that Caleb understood something she did not. Harry's voice interrupted the moment from the porch. "Nora, we're leaving in 10 minutes. She turned toward the house. "Coming." When she looked back at Caleb, he was already climbing into his truck. The engine started with a low rumble that he lowered the window briefly. "Whatever happens in that office," he said, "try to listen before deciding." Then the truck rolled down the lane, leaving Nora alone in the yard again. The dust settled slowly behind the tires. She stood still for several seconds before walking toward the house. Harry waited near the door holding the folder of documents. "You disappeared." I looked at the barn. Harry nodded, still standing. "And there's a horse." "Yes, the last one." Nora studied him. "Why didn't you mention the will might contain conditions?" Harry's expression tightened slightly, though he quickly masked it. "Because I doubt they're important." "You knew?" "I heard rumors from the notary's assistant, but nothing specific." Nora watched his face carefully. Harry had always been precise with information that he rarely ignored details unless he believed those details could complicate his plans. "You should have told me," she said. Harry opened the car door. "Let's hear the will first, then we'll know whether it matters." The drive to the notary's office took 15 minutes. The building stood near the town square beside the post office. It was a narrow brick structure with tall windows that reflected the cloudy sky. Nora remembered coming here once as a child when her father signed documents related to crop insurance. The interior still smelled of paper and polished wood. The receptionist guided them to a small conference room where a man in his 50s waited behind a long table that he wore thin glasses and a dark suit that looked slightly outdated but carefully maintained. His posture suggested years of professional routine. Ms. Walker. Mr. Walker, the notary said politely. Please sit. Nora and Harry took the chairs opposite him. The folder on the table looked thicker than the one Harry had prepared at home. Nora noticed that immediately. I understand this is a difficult day, the notary continued. Your father left very clear instructions regarding the transfer of property and responsibilities. Harry leaned forward slightly. We'd like to review the sale documents after the will. The notary adjusted his glasses. That may require discussion. Nora felt Harry's posture shift beside her. The first sign of tension appeared in his shoulders. Please read it, Nora said. The notary opened the folder and began calmly. I, Thomas Walker, being of sound mind and full awareness, leave the property known as Aldergrove Farm equally to my children Nora Walker and Harry Walker. Harry nodded once. That part matched his expectations. The notary continued reading without changing tone. However, the transfer of ownership includes a temporary restriction intended to preserve the land's original purpose. Nora felt the words slow the air in the room. Harry's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The property may not be sold, leased, or transferred to external buyers for a period of 6 months following the reading of this will. Harry spoke immediately. That's unreasonable. The notary raised one hand, gently signaling patience. There is additional context. Nora leaned forward. Go on. The man turned a page and read the next paragraph. During this 6-month period, the heirs must restore the original apiary located on the northern edge of the property and successfully produce the first harvest of honey from the land. Silence followed. Nora stared at the document as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more logical. Harry's chair creaked slightly as he leaned back. You're serious, Harry said quietly. The notary nodded. Your father believed the farm could still function as a sustainable agricultural property. He left a detailed explanation attached to the will. Harry exhaled sharply. The farm is bankrupt. Yes, that I'm aware. And he expects us to rebuild a beekeeping operation in 6 months. That is correct. Harry turned toward Nora. This is impossible. Nora remained silent for several seconds, processing the information. Caleb's voice echoed in her memory. Try to listen before deciding. Why 6 months? She asked. The notary slid a separate page toward her. Your father believed one full cycle of seasonal pollination would prove whether the land still had productive potential. If the harvest succeeds, the restriction may be lifted voluntarily by the heirs. If it fails, the farm may be sold without limitation. Harry laughed quietly, but without humor. So we waste half a year chasing bees and then sell anyway. Nora read the explanation carefully. The handwriting attached to the document was unmistakably her father's, small, precise letters filling the page. He had described the original apiary built by his grandfather. He had written about soil recovery and local pollination. He had even included sketches showing where the old hives once stood near the alder grove. Nora felt something unexpected move inside her chest. Not nostalgia exactly, something closer to curiosity. Harry pushed his chair back slightly. This changes nothing. The farm still has debts. We can't maintain it for 6 months without income. The notary folded his hands. Your father anticipated that concern. He arranged a temporary financial reserve accessible only for operational costs during the 6-month period. Harry stared. He what? Yes. The funds are modest, but sufficient for basic maintenance and restoration of the apiary. Nora finally looked up from the page. So he planned everything. The notary nodded. Very carefully. Harry rubbed his temples slowly. This delays the sale. That's all it does. Nora turned toward him. 6 months isn't forever. For someone living here, maybe. Not for people with real careers. The remark hung in the air. Nora understood the implication clearly. Harry believed she would return to Chicago and leave him alone to manage the obligation. But Nora did not answer immediately. She looked again at the handwriting on the page. The last line of the note stood alone beneath the explanation. Land remembers those who stay long enough to listen. Nora closed the folder slowly. Well, she said quietly, I guess we're keeping the farm for 6 months. The drive back to Aldergrove Farm happened in near silence. Harry kept both hands on the steering wheel and stared at the road with rigid concentration. Nora sat beside him holding the folder from the notary's office on her lap. She had read the handwritten page 3 times during the short trip, yet the meaning still felt unsettled inside her thoughts. 6 months. The number repeated itself quietly. The restriction was simple, but its consequences were not 0.6 months, meant delay 0.6 months, meant effort 0.6 months, meant living inside the unfinished story her father had left behind. Harry finally spoke when the farmhouse came into view. This changes nothing long-term. Nora turned her head slightly. You've said that already. Because it's still true. He parked near the porch and turned off the engine. The quiet returned immediately, just as it had earlier in the day, but now it carried more tension. Harry leaned back in the seat. The debts remain. The equipment is outdated. The land hasn't produced proper harvests in years. One small beekeeping project won't fix structural collapse. Nora opened the folder again and glanced at the drawings of the old apiary. Maybe it's not about fixing everything. Harry looked at her sharply. Then what is it about? Nora hesitated, searching for a precise answer. She disliked vague reasoning, yet the explanation forming in her mind did not feel purely logical. Maybe it's about testing whether anything here still works. Harry shook his head slowly. You sound like him. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Harry opened the door and stepped outside. The conversation ended there, but the disagreement remained visible in the tension of his shoulders. Nora followed him toward the porch carrying the folder. Inside the house, Harry placed his own documents on the kitchen table with controlled force. The developers will not wait forever. They'll survive 6 months, Nora replied. They might withdraw their offer. Then we'll negotiate again. Harry turned toward her. You say that like negotiation happens magically. Nora met his gaze calmly. It happens when both sides want something. Harry studied her expression carefully. He seemed to search for signs that her decision might still change. But Nora did not look uncertain anymore. The initial shock had settled into a strange, quiet determination. She had not planned to stay, but the challenge inside the will felt deliberate, almost like a question directed specifically at her. Harry exhaled slowly. Fine, 0.6 months, but we handle this efficiently. Meaning, we complete the requirement as fast as possible, then we sell. Nora closed the folder. We complete the requirement correctly, then we decide. The difference between those sentences was subtle but significant. Harry recognized it immediately. You're already reconsidering, he said. I'm evaluating. Harry walked toward the window and looked at the fields outside. This land destroyed our father financially. Nora joined him beside the window. It also defined his entire life. That doesn't mean we repeat his mistakes. Nora watched the distant barn where the horse stood somewhere inside the shadows. Maybe understanding the mistake matters before abandoning the place completely. Harry did not answer. He simply left the room and walked upstairs. The floorboards creaked under his steps until the sound disappeared behind a closed door. Nora remained in the kitchen alone. She opened the folder again and spread the drawings across the table. The sketches showed a small cluster of wooden hives arranged in a semicircle near the alder grove. There were notes about wind direction, sunlight, and seasonal flowering plants. She recognized her father's careful thinking in every detail. The door outside opened suddenly. Nora looked up expecting Harry, but Caleb stepped inside instead. He removed his hat politely, though his presence still carried the quiet confidence she remembered from the barn. I figured the meeting ended by now, he said. Nora folded the pages slowly. You were right about the conditions. Caleb nodded. Your father mentioned them more than once. Did he tell you the exact requirement? Restore the apiary and harvest honey. Nora studied him. You knew the entire time. Yes. And you didn't warn me clearly. Caleb leaned against the doorway. It wasn't my place to explain your father's will. Nora considered arguing, but stopped. The logic was difficult to challenge. 6 months, she said instead. Caleb glanced toward the window where the alder trees stood in the distance. That's enough time if someone works seriously. Nora lifted an eyebrow. You sound optimistic. I sound realistic. Bees don't care about financial spreadsheets. They care about habitat. Nora tapped the drawing with one finger. According to this, the old apiary was near the northern grove. Caleb stepped closer to the table and studied the sketch. That's correct. The soil there still produces wildflowers in spring. You've been observing the land. I live 10 minutes away that it's difficult not to notice when a farm slowly fades. Nora crossed her arms. So what's your interest in helping? Caleb met her eyes calmly. Your father helped my family once even after everything that happened between them. Nora frowned. What exactly happened? Caleb hesitated briefly but answered. A legal dispute years ago, land boundaries, water rights that it damaged both farms financially. Nora remembered fragments of arguments from childhood, voices raised behind closed doors, but never the full explanation. So our families sued each other, she said. Yes. And now you're offering help. Caleb shrugged slightly. Time changes priorities. Nora looked again at the drawing of the hives. Do you actually know how to run an apiary? My grandfather taught me. Recently. No, but bees follow consistent patterns. Nora leaned back against the chair, considering the situation. Harry wanted speed. Caleb offered knowledge. The wool demanded results. The farm waited silently outside, as if observing their decisions. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it properly. Caleb nodded once. That's the only way it works. And you're volunteering to help. I'm offering experience. You still make the decisions. Nora glanced toward the staircase where Harry had disappeared earlier. She knew he would oppose involving Caleb too deeply, but the practical reality was obvious. She knew nothing about bees. Show me the grove, she said finally. Caleb pushed away from the table without hesitation. Now? Yes. They stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The sky remained gray, but the wind had softened slightly. Caleb walked along a narrow path behind the barn while Nora followed. The grass brushed against their shoes, and small insects moved quietly among the stems. The farm felt less empty when someone walked through it with purpose. After several minutes, the trees appeared ahead. The alder grove stood thicker, here forming a natural barrier between the farm fields and the surrounding hills. The ground beneath them was darker, richer with fallen leaves. Caleb stopped near a clearing. Here. Nora looked around carefully. At first, she saw only uneven ground and scattered wooden fragments. Then she noticed the remains of square platforms half buried under soil. Old supports for beehives. This was the apiary, Caleb said. Nora knelt and brushed away dirt from one of the platforms. The wood was weathered but still solid enough to show its original shape. She imagined rows of small wooden boxes standing here years ago, with bees moving through the air like living threads connecting flowers across the farm. Why did he abandon it? She asked quietly. Caleb looked toward the distant fields. The lawsuit drained money. Then crop failures followed. He focused on survival, not restoration. Nora stood again. The grove felt strangely peaceful despite the farm's financial chaos. She understood why her father had chosen this location. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating soft patterns across the ground. The place carried potential even in its neglected state. How many hives would we need? She asked. Caleb considered the space. At least 12 to produce a meaningful harvest. Nora exhaled slowly. That sounds expensive. Less expensive than rebuilding an entire farm. Nora watched a small breeze move through the leaves above them. The sound reminded her of distant water flowing over stones. Calm, steady, patient. 6 months suddenly felt less like an obstacle and more like a test she had not expected to take. She looked at Caleb again. Tomorrow we start clearing this area. Caleb nodded once without surprise. I'll bring tools. Nora turned toward the farmhouse in the distance. She could already imagine Harry's reaction when he realized the project had begun for real, but the decision felt clear in her mind now. The wool had asked a question, and she intended to answer it honestly. Behind them, the quiet grove waited, as if recognizing that the farm's future had just taken its first small step forward. Morning arrived over Alder Grove Farm with a pale gray light spreading slowly across the fields. Nora woke earlier than she expected. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of wind touching the outer walls. For a moment, she remained in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality of the situation settle again. 6 months. The thought no longer felt like a temporary inconvenience. It felt like a structure already forming around her days. She dressed quickly and walked downstairs. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee. Harry sat at the table, already awake, reading something on his laptop. His posture looked stiff, as if he had slept poorly. "You're up early," he said without looking away from the screen. "So are you." Harry closed the laptop slowly. "I was calculating costs." Nora poured herself coffee. And restoring an apiary from nothing is not cheap." Nora sat across from him. "We have the reserve fund." "Yes, but that money was meant for basic operations, not experimental agriculture." "It's not experimental if the farm originally worked that way." Harry studied her carefully. "You spoke with Caleb yesterday." It was not a question. Nora simply nodded. Harry leaned back in his chair. "Of course you did. He understands bees. He understands farms failing slowly." Nora kept her voice calm. "He offered practical help." Harry rubbed his forehead. "Nora, this isn't a community project. It's a legal requirement we need to complete as efficiently as possible. And efficiency means ignoring the only person who actually knows what he's doing." Harry did not answer immediately. His silence carried frustration rather than agreement. Finally, he stood and walked toward the window. "I don't trust him," he said quietly. "Because of the old lawsuit? Because people don't suddenly become generous without reasons." Nora sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe the reason is simple. He grew up here too." Harry turned back toward her. "That didn't stop his family from dragging ours through court." Nora did not respond to that argument. She knew the history was complicated and neither of them had been old enough to understand it properly at the time. Instead, she placed the cup on the table. "We start clearing the grove today." Harry's expression hardened. "You're serious?" "Yes. And you already invited him." "I asked for help." Harry exhaled slowly, clearly trying to remain calm. "Fine. But I want transparency. If he's involved, I want to know exactly what he's doing on this property." "That's reasonable." Harry nodded once, though his face showed little satisfaction. "I have calls to make today about delaying the sale discussions." Nora stood from the table. "Tell them the farm is under temporary restoration." Harry gave a short, humorless smile. Developers love hearing that. Outside, the air carried the cool freshness of early morning. The fields looked slightly brighter than the previous day as thin sunlight moved through the clouds. Nora walked toward the barn first. The horse greeted her with a soft movement of its head as she approached the stall. She found an old brush hanging nearby and gently ran it along the animal's neck. The repetitive motion helped clear her thoughts. "You're probably the least complicated part of this place," she murmured quietly. A truck engine sounded in the distance. Nora stepped outside and watched Caleb's vehicle roll slowly down the gravel lane. He parked near the fence line and climbed out carrying several tools in the back of the truck, a shovel, 2 axes, and a bundle of wooden stakes. "You came prepared," Nora said when he approached. Caleb glanced toward the grove. "Clearing takes time." Nora gestured toward the trees. "Let's see how bad it is." They walked the path behind the barn again. The ground still held traces of morning dew, and the grass brushed against their legs. The grove looked slightly different in daylight. The remains of the old platforms were easier to see scattered across the clearing, like quiet reminders of a forgotten system. Caleb handed Nora a pair of work gloves. "First step is removing the debris. We need stable ground for the new hives." Nora pulled the gloves on. "How long will that take?" "A few days if we work steadily." She nodded and picked up a fallen branch, dragging it toward a growing pile near the edge of the grove. The work felt physical, straightforward, almost refreshing after years of office routines in Chicago. Each movement produced visible progress. Small patches of clean ground slowly appeared between the leaves and broken wood. Caleb worked methodically nearby, occasionally pointing out where old supports had once stood. That he seemed to remember the layout with surprising accuracy, as if the structure still existed in his mind even after years of neglect. "Your grandfather designed the original placement," he explained while clearing soil from a buried platform. "He arranged the hives to catch morning sunlight while blocking strong western winds." Nora crouched beside him, examining the uncovered wood. "You remember details like that." "My family kept bees too." "Still." Caleb shook his head. "Not anymore. After the lawsuit, my father sold most of the equipment." The sentence carried quiet weight. Nora sensed there were layers of resentment and regret beneath it, but she did not push further. The past between their families was complicated enough already. Hours passed gradually. The pile of debris grew larger, and the open space between the trees became clearer. By midday sunlight reached the center of the grove for the first time in years. Nora stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead. She felt tired but strangely satisfied. "This already looks different," she said. Caleb nodded. "Restoration usually begins that way. Small, visible changes." They walked toward the farmhouse for water. Harry stood on the porch speaking on his phone. When he noticed them approaching, he ended the call quickly. His eyes moved from Nora to Caleb, measuring the scene with cautious attention. "Progress?" Harry asked. "Some," Nora replied. Caleb remained polite but distant. "The ground is clearing well." Harry folded his arms. "Good. Just remember the goal is one harvest, not a permanent business." Caleb met his gaze calmly. Bees rarely work under strict deadlines. Harry's jaw tightened slightly. "Then we encourage them." The tension between them was subtle but undeniable. Nora stepped between the conversation before it could deepen. "We'll need materials for new hives," she said. "Wood frames, protective gear, everything." Harry nodded reluctantly. "I'll review the reserve fund this afternoon." Caleb looked toward the grove again. "There's another thing." Both siblings turned to him. "The land needs flowers. Native plants preferably. If the bees don't have consistent sources, they won't produce enough honey." Nora considered that. "How many plants?" "Hundreds." Harry sighed quietly. "Of course." But Nora felt a small spark of excitement instead. For the first time since arriving, the farm no longer felt like a dying property waiting to be sold. It felt like a project slowly unfolding piece by piece. Later that evening, after Caleb left, Nora walked alone back to the grove. The cleared ground looked wider now, and the remaining sunlight filtered gently through the branches. She stood in the center, imagining rows of wooden hives, standing here again, with bees moving steadily between flowers and trees. For years she had believed this place belonged only to the past. But standing there in the quiet clearing, she began to sense another possibility forming. Not yet clear, not yet certain, but real enough to make her stay a little longer before returning to the house. The next several days established a rhythm that Aldergrove Farm had not seen in years. Nora woke early each morning before the sun fully rose. The quiet house slowly filled with small sounds again. Footsteps across wooden floors, the clink of dishes, the creak of the front door opening toward the fields. Harry usually stayed inside managing calls and paperwork, while Nora walked toward the grove, where Caleb arrived shortly after sunrise with tools in the back of his truck. The clearing process continued steadily. They removed fallen branches, pulled old rusted nails from the remaining wooden platforms, and leveled uneven patches of soil. Caleb marked the ground with small stakes indicating where the new hives would eventually stand. Nora followed his instructions carefully, even when she did not fully understand the reasoning. "Spacing matters," Caleb explained one morning while adjusting the position of a stake. "If the hives are too close, the bees compete too aggressively. If they're too far, the colony loses efficiency." Nora looked across the growing pattern forming in the clearing. "You talk about them like a city." "In a way they are," Caleb replied. "Each hive functions like a small, organized system." The comparison made sense to Nora. She had spent years navigating corporate structures where every role served a specific function. Perhaps bees were simply a more honest version of the same idea. By the fourth day, the grove looked almost unrecognizable compared to when they first arrived. The ground was clear enough to reveal the original semicircle layout, drawn in her father's notes. .12 spaces now waited for new wooden hives. Nora stepped back and studied the arrangement. "This matches the sketch exactly." Caleb nodded. "Your father knew what he was doing." That sentence carried quiet reassurance. Nora realized she had spent years assuming the farm failed purely because her father had mismanaged it. But the evidence scattered around the property suggested something more complicated. Later that afternoon, they began assembling the first hive frames. Caleb brought pre-cut wooden pieces that required careful alignment and fastening. Nora sat at a portable work table near the grove, holding boards steady, while Caleb secured them with screws. "This one becomes the brood box," he said, pointing to the larger frame. "It's where the queen lays eggs." "And the others?" "Those hold honey once the colony grows." Nora ran her fingers along the smooth edges of the wood. The structure looked simple yet precise. "How long until bees move in?" "Soon. That will bring the first colonies next week." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You already have them?" "I arranged it with a beekeeper outside town, but he's willing to sell 3 starter colonies." "Only 3. They multiply if the conditions are right." The practical confidence in Caleb's voice gradually replaced Nora's earlier skepticism. She realized that each step of the process connected logically to the next. Nothing about the project felt random. When the sun began lowering behind the hills, they carried the finished frame to the first marked platform. Caleb placed it carefully in position and stepped back, examining the alignment. "There," he said quietly. "First hive location ready." Nora looked at the wooden box resting in the clearing, that a simple object, but it represented the beginning of something the farm had not attempted in years. 11 more, she said. Caleb gave a small nod. One step at a time. That evening, Nora returned to the house tired but satisfied. Harry sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents again. When she entered, he looked up briefly. "You've been working nonstop," he observed. "So have you. Paperwork is easier than rebuilding ecosystems." Nora poured herself water and leaned against the counter. "Any updates from the developers?" "They're impatient." "That's predictable." Harry closed one of the folders. "They asked whether the 6-month restriction is negotiable." "It's not. I told them that." Nora studied him carefully. "You still want the sale to happen as soon as possible?" "Yes." "And if the harvest works?" Harry hesitated. That pause was the first sign his certainty might not be absolute. "If it works," he said finally, "we evaluate the numbers again." Nora accepted that answer for now. It was not enthusiasm, but it was not outright resistance either. The following week brought the next major step. Caleb's truck arrived one morning carrying 3 wooden transport boxes. The faint buzzing sound coming from inside them filled the air even before he opened the back door. Nora stood nearby, feeling both curious and nervous. "Those are them," Caleb said. Nora folded her arms instinctively. "They sound busy." "They always are." He handed her a protective veil and gloves. "Put these on." Nora pulled the mesh veil over her head and adjusted the gloves carefully. The equipment felt unfamiliar but necessary. Caleb lifted the first transport box and carried it toward the prepared hive platform. "Stay calm and move slowly," he instructed. "Bees react to sudden motion." Nora nodded, though her heart beat faster as the buzzing grew louder. Caleb opened the hive box, gently revealing wooden frames already filled with living movement. Thousands of bees crawled across the honeycomb structures, working with quiet intensity. For a moment, Nora simply watched. The sight was mesmerizing rather than frightening. Each insect moved with purpose, forming shifting patterns across the golden wax cells. "Where's the queen?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere in there," Caleb replied. "We don't disturb her unless necessary." He transferred the frames carefully into the prepared hive structure, closing the lid once the colony settled inside. The buzzing softened slightly as the bees adjusted to their new home. "That's one," Caleb said. 2 more colonies followed before midday. By the time the last hive closed, the grove carried a steady low hum, like distant electricity moving through the air. Nora stepped back, removing her veil slowly. "They're actually staying," she said. "They will if the environment supports them." Nora looked around the grove where sunlight filtered through the alder leaves. The cleared ground now held 3 living colonies and 9 empty spaces waiting for future growth. For the first time, the farm felt truly active again. But as she and Caleb packed away the equipment, Nora noticed a figure standing near the edge of the field watching them. Harry stood there silently with his arms crossed. His expression was difficult to read, yet his presence reminded Nora that the project had another layer of pressure beyond bees and flowers. When Caleb drove away later that afternoon, Harry approached the grove slowly. The hum of the hives filled the space between him and Nora. "So that's what our inheritance looks like now," he said. Nora nodded. 3 colonies. Harry studied the wooden boxes carefully. "Do they actually produce enough honey to matter?" "They can." Harry remained quiet for several seconds, listening to the constant buzzing sound. Finally, he spoke again, but his voice carried a different tone than before. "I signed a preliminary agreement with the developers yesterday." Nora turned sharply. "What kind of agreement?" "Nothing final," Harry said quickly. "Just a framework. They're willing to wait 6 months if the deal stays exclusive." Nora felt tension tighten in her chest. "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." She looked from him to the hives again, realizing the project might already be facing pressures she had not anticipated. The bees worked calmly inside their boxes, unaware of contracts, negotiations, and hidden deadlines. Nora faced her brother again. Next time we discuss decisions before signing anything. Harry held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. The gesture looked cooperative, but something in his expression suggested deeper calculations still unfolding beneath the surface. The hum of the bees continued steadily in the grove as evening light settled across Aldergrove Farm, marking the quiet beginning of a season that would test every decision they made. The second and third months demanded a transition from raw labor to delicate maintenance. While Nora handled the daily inspections, Caleb focused on the expansion of the wildflower perimeters to ensure a steady nectar flow. By the end of the third month, the apiary had reached its full scale of 12 active colonies, the symmetrical semicircle of cedar hives finally matching the vision in her father's sketches. The farm no longer felt like a collection of neglected fields, but a coordinated, living landscape. The arrival of the fourth month pushed the operation into its most delicate phase. The grove now housed the full set of 12 hives, a symmetrical semicircular fortress of cedar and buzzing life. But a new shadow appeared over the grove when Nora noticed deep tire tracks near the northern fence. Heavy, treaded marks that didn't belong to Caleb's truck or their own. It was a silent warning that the developers were losing patience. They're scouting the boundaries, Caleb observed one evening. Nora's focus hardened. She realized the harvest was no longer just about the will, but about proving the land's worth before the lawyers moved in. By the fifth month, the air in the grove grew heavy with the scent of ripening honey. Every frame was a golden weight, a testament to the soil's recovery that Harry could no longer ignore. Caleb spent the final weeks teaching Nora the precise mechanics of the centrifugal extractor, ensuring the honey was drawn without damaging the delicate wax foundations. "This is the critical phase," he explained, his voice low against the constant hum. "Any mistake now affects the final yield." By the sixth month, the tension in the grove shifted from preparation to the finality of the harvest. Nora focused solely on the extraction process, ensuring every frame was handled with the precision her father's notes demanded. The uncertainty of the future remained, but the physical reality of the filled honeycombs provided a weight that no legal document could easily dismiss. The sixth month ended not with a signature, but with the heavy, golden weight of the harvest. As Nora watched the last of the jars being sealed, the farm no longer felt like a debt to be paid. It was a living legacy that had reclaimed her, a reminder that some roots are too deep to be pulled, even by the strongest of storms.